Well, good afternoon and welcome to the panel on economic competitiveness in a globalized world. I really appreciate everyone being here at 3:30 on a Friday afternoon. That is wonderful, although it is a pretty nice dig, so this is a nice place to be. My name is Cynthia Osborne. I'm an assistant professor at the LBJ School, and I'm really thrilled to be able to moderate this panel this afternoon. And the general purpose of this panel is to explore whether the next generation of workers is really prepared to fulfill their roles in our labor market and what this might mean for the economic competitiveness in the United States in this more global economy. We're also going to touch on whether other countries are facing similar dilemmas, and we're going to explore what it is that we're doing in the United States to try to address this problem and whether other countries are exploring some of these issues as well. Recently, the importance of educating our citizens so that we may remain economically competitive has been more broadly discussed than in times past. Just the other day, Nicholas Kristof, an opinion writer at the New York Times, stated that revitalizing our education system must be our #1 priority. He said that this needs to replace healthcare as our #1 priority because it is the only way to preserve economic competitiveness. Claudia Golden and Larry Katz, both Harvard economists, in their new book argue that the decline in our educational system since the 1970s has led to an increase in income inequality in the United States, and it's compromised our country's ability to remain economically competitive. Jim Heckman, the Nobel laureate economist from the University of Chicago, has argued repeatedly that investing early and often in children is, and I quote, "the rare public policy initiative that promotes fairness and social justice, and at the same time promotes productivity in the economy and in society at large." Well, so is there really cause for concern? Is there a problem that we need to address? Well, I think that perhaps there is. Our population growth is being fueled by those who are relatively disadvantaged. I'm a demographer, and so I think about things in a population perspective. In Texas, 80% of our state's population growth over the next 30 years will be driven by Hispanics, and the remainder by African American children. Demography is not destiny, but if we don't change course, then we do face a potential dilemma. Fewer than half of Hispanics will complete their high school education. In addition, as compared to their Anglo counterparts, Hispanic children are much less likely to receive adequate health care and nutrition. They're more likely to live in poverty, and they're more likely to come from a home in which English is not spoken. All of these have negative consequences for their educational outcomes. Not surprisingly then, as adults, their earnings are less than half of their Anglo counterparts. I'm not saying these things, please don't interpret my statements to mean that I'm complaining about the growth in the Hispanic population. Rather, I'm just trying to call attention to the fact that if present trends continue and we don't do something to create more parity, then the education level and the economic viability of our state and our country in general will actually decline. So now's the time to address these issues. We have the fortune of having these 3 noted professors here on our panel this afternoon to lead the discussion on these issues. I'm going to ask a broad question to a specific panel member, and then following their response, I will welcome discussion among the other panelists. And I'm also going to ensure that there's time at the end to open up the discussion to you guys so that we can all join in. I want to introduce our 3 panel members here today. First is Dr. Stephen Trejo. He's an associate professor of economics here at UT, and he is also the associate director of the Population Research Center here. He holds a PhD from the University of Chicago and also has a degree from the University of California at Santa Barbara, where he taught for, I think, about 12 years before coming here in 1999. I think he's been in search of the good life since leaving Chicago. Dr. Trejo's primary research focus is in the field of labor economics. He has examined the response of labor market participants to the incentives created by market opportunities, government policies, and the institutional environment. And some of his specific studies include the immigrant labor market experience and welfare receipt, as well as the relative economic status and intergenerational progress of Mexican Americans. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Trejo. Next is Dr. Keith Robinson. He's an assistant professor at the Department of Sociology here at UT and a research affiliate of the Population Research Center. He received his PhD from the University of Michigan and also holds a degree from UCLA. His research focuses on the determinants and implications of the test score gap, or achievement inequalities, in K through 12 education. His work highlights the extent to which family and school factors contribute to achievement inequality, and his work suggests ways to equalize these differences. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Robinson. And our third panel member is Dr. Jennifer Jellison-Holme, who is an assistant professor of educational policy and planning in the Department of Educational Administration. I think that's all correct. She holds a PhD from UCLA and a master's in education from Harvard's Graduate School of Education. Her research agenda is centered on the politics and implementation of educational policy with two major focuses. The implementation of accountability policies, including accountability measures and high-stakes testing, as well as implementations of policies designed to foster greater equity and diversity in schools. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Holme. Well, I am very glad that you guys could all be here together today. And what I was hoping is that, Steve, you could kind of set the stage for us and help us to really understand, do we have a crisis? Are we not going to be economically competitive? Kind of help us understand the relationship between the labor market and our ability to be economically competitive and kind of how we've got here.
Okay. I mean, the bottom line is that increasing education is and always has been for the United States an important engine of our economic growth. But the key point is that's really true regardless of whether other countries are increasing their education levels. So one thing I want to talk about a little at the beginning, just because I think there's sometimes some misguided views about economic competition among countries. A lot of times sort of international competition is thought about as kind of a winner-take-all kind of competition. And where if one country's a little bit more educated or a little bit more productive than another country, they're going to get all the good jobs and be the big winners, and everybody else is the loser. International trade in general and international competitiveness in terms of education in particular don't really work that way. Trade, with a thing that economists emphasize since Adam Smith, is trade among people who undertake it voluntarily is mutually beneficial. And it helps everybody. And education is important, but the key thing is it's really important for us regardless of whether we have a little bit more or a little bit less education on average than other countries. Sometimes people think about competition as being like players competing for a spot on a football team. So people are competing to be the running back or the quarterback of the football team, and if one player's a little bit better than the others, he gets the spot, he gets all the playing time, everybody else sits on the bench. And sometimes people think about international competition that way. I don't even think that analogy works well for football, and there's a couple of examples in recent experience for the University of Texas where that kind of belie that analogy for football. And one is there was a running back named Henry Melton, who was on the 2005 team that won the national championship. And he actually played quite a bit that year. He was a big guy. He would come in when they needed just a few yards or needed to score a touchdown. I think he scored 10 touchdowns in 2005 on the team that won the national championship. Then his sophomore year, he didn't play as much. They were better running backs. It was pretty clear he wasn't going to play much as a running back. He switched to defensive end and became a very effective, very successful defensive end and was one of the top players on the defense this year. So, there are skills get used in different places, even if you're not the very best at something. And actually, there was another player named Jevon Sneed who, when he was a freshman, he was competing with Colt McCoy for being the starting quarterback. They had a very close competition. It wasn't clear who was going to win the competition. In the end, Colt McCoy won it, became the starter, became a very successful quarterback. Jevon Sneed transferred to the University of Mississippi, where he had a great year last year. So, skills get used. They don't, there's lots of places where skills can get used, even in football. And in the international arena, it's much more so than that. In the economic arena, it's much more so. There's, lots of different places people can work and lots of different jobs they can have and lots of different goods countries can produce depending on the skills of their workers. So that's just to say that sometimes the debate gets focused on the fact that at one point we had a big lead over other countries in terms of average educational attainment and how widespread education was in our population. The last 20 or 30 years, we've kind of lost that edge, and actually countries like Japan and some Scandinavian countries have overtaken us in terms of average education. And I think that could be a problem, but it's not really a problem because because they've done well. It's a problem because, as I'll talk about in a second, our educational growth has slowed down considerably, and I think that's what the problem is. So let me just lay out really quickly the what's gone on with education, and a lot of this is laid out very well in this book by Claudia Golden and Larry Katz that Cynthia talked about. And the book talks about the race between education and technology. And what's happened in terms of education is the U.S. was really a pioneer. We were the first country to try to educate the masses. So starting in the 19th century, we were the first country to really provide free and accessible elementary education to most citizens, with African Americans and American Indians being notable exceptions. But we were the first country to really try to educate a large fraction of the population, not just the elites. In the early parts of the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, there was this big movement to get high school available for everybody. So everybody could take some high school, and high school graduation rates became the norm for people by 1940 or 1950. After World War II, there would be partly because of the GI Bill, but for other reasons too, there was a big expansion in higher education, and college education became much more accessible to the middle class, and that became much more widespread. So basically, from before 1900 through about 1970, there was this strong and steady growth in average educational attainment in the United States, that more and more people were getting more and more schooling, and average schooling levels were going up. Since about 1970, there's been stagnation, and there hasn't been much growth in average education levels. And part of that is due to the fact that college attendance has declined for young men, and that's part of it. But overall, there hasn't been this continued growth, and that's when some of these other countries, we had a big lead over almost all countries as of 1970, and that gap was closed by most European and Western countries today. So we don't have the big lead that we used to have. Now, why is that important? Part of it is just raising everybody's productivity, raising everybody's skills, raises earnings and raises productivity. So that's the big part of the standard of living growth that we experienced from 1900 to 1970 and from well before that comes from increasing education. That's not the only source, but that's been a big source. The other thing that Katz and Golden point out is that there is this race between the growth in education and the growth in technology. And what's been true for as long as we have the data for, at least from before 1900 through the present day, what's been true is that technological change has tended to increase the demand for skilled, educated workers. So, and it's been pretty steady, too. It's not just from computerization or recent things like that. There's been this, different technological advances that have occurred historically have increased the demand for more skilled, more educated workers and raised their relative productivity. But what was happening in the first part of the 1900s, when the supply of educated workers was growing even faster than the increased demand from technology, is that everybody's wages were going up. The educated workers, their wages were going up because they were getting more education, becoming more productive, and there was this increased demand for their education. But the less educated workers were actually gaining too, because they were becoming a more scarce resource as more and more people got education. So there was this widespread increase in the standard of living without increased inequality. Now, because educational growth stagnated after 1970, what's happened since then is it's only the workers getting more education, and particularly college education, who's had their standard of living go up. And everybody else has had their standard of living either remain constant, or for people with low education levels, like high school dropouts and even people with just a high school degree, their standard of living hasn't increased. So that's where there's a potential issue. That, one thing about widespread increases in education, it seems like that's been the way historically, where we've been able to, in some ways, make everybody better off, raise everybody's wages without increasing the gaps between rich and poor, and the gaps between educated and less educated.
But over this time period, we have remained very economically competitive, even though we've been kind of skewing this pyramid of who's educated. If it gets smaller, is this a problem? Or is it possible that if we just have a few really well-skilled workers, that we are still going to be able to kind of be the leader that we've been in the past? Or why do we want to?
The way I look at it is more education is going to be better in terms of increasing skills, and it's going to make us better off. Whether we're a leader or not, there's going to be things that some of the countries that have experienced the biggest growth in GDP and incomes have been countries that were relatively less educated and grew, and they're not countries that are producing the most technologically advanced goods, but they've got markets where they can produce goods cheaper than other countries, and they've grown that way. So there's different niches that different workers and different economies can take. One of the things I think that one of the issues is, as if we just kind of reach some natural ceiling on education levels. It's just too hard, too expensive maybe to get bigger swaths of the population to go on to college. Is that the issue? And there's nothing we can do about it. I think one thing that the fact that Japan and Scandinavian countries have still had these continued increases in education, I think that, and now have surpassed us, that tells us that it is possible to do it. And the other thing that suggests it's worth doing is the payoff to education, the extra earnings that college-educated workers get relative to high school-educated workers. So the labor market payoff to getting more education is as high as it's ever been in our history. So it's not that, we've just reached some limit, or the return, the increased productivity from that extra education isn't there anymore, so it's not worth doing. There's a big payoff to doing.
So, Keith, can you talk a little bit about who it is that is going on to college and what these differences are, and who is this group? Because what we've seen, what Steve has just laid out, is that over the past 30 years, we have had a smaller share of our population who's been going on to becoming educated. But at the same time, we've had a much larger share of women and minorities going to college than in times past. But help us understand who it is that's getting educated in this country and who is not. And another question is not just college education, but are we actually becoming educated if you graduate from high school? Are we is that an education of itself? And help us understand that.
Well, to your original question about crisis, is this a crisis? Steve took issue with the word competition. And typically, whether you think this is a crisis or not has to do with how this issue is framed. And so it has been framed in the sense of competition, primarily because, and there's this sentiment that our reliance on international talent, if you will, because typically when we're talking about competition, we're talking about some type of development of talent at the heart of this. The sentiment is that our reliance on this international talent is much like our reliance on foreign oil, if you will, that we are running dangerously close to the brink of running out of supplies. And so we need to remove our dependence on international talent and start investing in our own talent, creating talent within the U.S. education system so that we can now meet the demands of a growing competitive global market. The problem, though, is that when we look at our own supply of students, that we see that they are woefully inadequate to meet the needs in certain ways. I'm sure we'll talk about math and science education. And so the problem then is, what do we do about it? And that gets back to this issue of whether it's a crisis or not. In terms of who's being educated now, one of the things that Steve also mentioned was that colleges are now having to struggle with this idea that we are seeing a growing number of high school graduates. A growing number of high school graduates on the whole are entering colleges. Now the question becomes, how do we accommodate them But if you look at the supply that's coming through, there are some problems there. One of the reasons, I'll go back, one of the reasons that there's been a growing number of high school graduates has to do with the baby boom. But baby boomer kids are now going through college, and they'll be going through college for the next couple years. Also, as Steve mentioned, there's been just the actual value of what college education means and where it'll get you in life has now taken on a higher significance. And so now you see more people applying to colleges. In terms of who's being educated, we are seeing that there are a number of issues related to who actually makes it to college, and once they get there, how well are they being trained. There are, in terms of, you mentioned Hispanics earlier, Hispanics also have the highest dropout rates. And so one of the problems there is how do we keep them, starting from K through 12, how do we keep them in that pipeline so that we can then educate them once they get to college? Once they get to college, I'm focusing specifically on Hispanics, once they get to college, we also see now that they, just like other minorities, are less likely to take certain types of courses, particularly those which relate to this conference here that have to do with math and science. If you look across the board, if you look at AP calculus, if you look at trigonometry, statistics, and courses like these math classes, and if you look across the sciences as well, you see that minorities are taking these classes. They're graduating from high school and entering colleges, but in a smaller proportion of them, relative to whites and Asians, have even taken these classes, let alone experienced AP courses, which we think are important for training the next generation of technologically sound college graduates, and which will then go on to be future workers.
Right. So we have more and more who are showing up, but they're not showing up as prepared when they get to college, and they're not finishing college at the same rates as well, or some of the points that you were making with that as well. I think that that's interesting in terms of the supply versus demand, or the supply, whether we actually have a supply of internal kids that our own education system is actually producing, or whether we have to import, if you will, like you were saying, our talent. And
yeah, I think that's an important point. In that, another way to look at it is one of the big, if we're trying to restart growth in education in the United States, one of the huge advantages we have, one of the huge tools we have, is that we have the preeminent system of higher education in the world. And that system increasingly attracts the brightest foreign students. And one good thing is that about a third of foreign undergraduate and graduate students who are educated here end up staying and working here, and so we take advantage of that labor. But the issue is we need, that especially in technical fields, that domestic students are less well prepared from high school to do undergraduate and especially graduate study in more technical fields. And so there's an opportunity there that we haven't seized yet. But in some ways, the good thing is we've already got the college and graduate schools to profitably educate these people. It's just getting more domestic students to the stage where they can take advantage of it.
where they can actually do it.
And actually, I have a point that I can sort of to build on this. It's sort of a paradox in the U.S. educational system, and one of the things that's really interesting is that we have actually relatively greater access in education in terms of secondary education, not post-secondary, just secondary, in terms of high school level than a lot of other countries. A lot of other countries, in terms of Scandinavian countries, Japan, et cetera, actually differentiate their education at the age of 15, so that kids actually have to test into relatively more rigorous versus less rigorous high school education. And that really has an implication for this pipeline. The U.S., by contrast, actually has relatively equal access in terms of getting kids up through high school, getting them exposure to a curriculum. But then we have this funny paradox in that we are actually achieving less well on indicators in terms of the PISA math and science indicators. But I think what's missing in a lot of the conversations about our economic competitiveness is that in this country we place a lot of emphasis on public education in terms of it is a big aspect of our social welfare system, and we place a lot less emphasis on other social welfare policies than other countries. And so you see a lot of inequities within our system, and so that you compare the achievement of kids on the top 10%, the top decile in terms of PISA performance, and we actually do relatively as well on science, relatively as well on math. We have far, far more many students doing worse in terms of when you compare the bottom chunk of kids than other nations. So we have these sort of greater gaps within our system, and I think those are really very much connected to our lack of other social supports. And in this country, it's also worth knowing, lots of research has shown that achievement in this country is more highly correlated with indicators of parental education, parental income, and other family characteristics than other countries. So that we tend to provide lots of access to education, but then we